Antes de empezar con el podcast de hoy, quiero invitarte al curso de Pensamiento Complejo, Crítico, Multidisciplinario y Sistémico en Salud, que está por empezar el 5 de octubre. Este curso y esta comunidad somos personas que estamos cuestionando los paradigmas actuales de salud y bienestar y estamos co-creando las nuevas posibilidades para el futuro de esta industria, de esta técnica, de esta metodología y de esta cosa que nos interesa tanto a todos, que es la salud y el bienestar. Más información en victorsadia.com/cursos.
Science is great, but not everything that counts can be counted, as Albert Einstein once said. Not everything that's meaningful is measurable. So the challenge in lifestyle medicine is to be able to use all of the tools that we have and not just the ones that we can measure.
Welcome to Back to the Future podcast. My name is Victor Sadia, and I talk with brilliant minds and hearts of people who want to uproot and transform the current health and wellness paradigm. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have DrDean Ornish. DrDean Ornish is the founder of the Preventive Medicine Research Institute. He's a professor of medicine at the University of California. He received his training in internal medicine from the BaylorCollege of Medicine, HarvardMedical School, and the Massachusetts General Hospital. He is the author of 6 best-selling books and has published extensively in the top scientific journals. He is considered the father of lifestyle medicine. What does it mean to be a hero? What does it mean to be on a journey? And what does it mean to be the father of so many personal, collective, and even society-wide journeys in lifestyle medicine?
Wow, that's a lot. Well, the hero's journey was a term that Joseph Campbell talked about. And we're all on the hero's journey, that life is a hero's journey. And we, in various spiritual traditions, we incarnate, we take human form so that we can experience what it means to be fully alive and learn certain lessons and grow in wisdom and learn to love better. So to me, lifestyle medicine is really the field that shows how the lifestyle choices that we make each day of the most common chronic diseases. I think that's our unique contribution, has been using very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove how powerful these very simple and low-tech and low-cost and often ancient interventions can be. We tend to think of advances in medicine as being something really high-tech and expensive, a new drug, a new laser, a new device, something like that. And we often have a hard time believing that these simple choices can make such a powerful difference for better and for worse, but they do. And because these underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, when you make these changes, it's not just about preventing something bad from happening years down the road or fear of dying. It's really about joy of living, that when you make these changes, most people find they feel so much better so quickly. It reframes the reason for making lifestyle changes from fear of dying to joy of living. And joy and pleasure and love and feeling good are ultimately what enable us to make sustainable changes. But it's not even just about living longer. I got interested in doing this work out of my own suffering. I think that we're not really trained in healthcare and in medicine in particular to show people how suffering can really be a doorway for transforming our lives in ways that can be really powerful. I can't tell you how many patients have said to me things like, having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me, or getting diagnosed with breast cancer or whatever. And the first time I heard this, I said, what are you, nuts? And they said, no, that's what it took to get my attention to begin making these changes that have made my life so much more joyful and meaningful, and rediscovering inner sources of peace and joy and well-being and so on, that I probably never would have done had I not been suffering. But, I'm trained, like most doctors, to view suffering as something to get rid of as quickly as possible, kill the pain with narcotics or, surgery or whatever. But the pain is not the problem. The pain is really the messenger. It's saying, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. And so in my own hero's journey, if you will, what started me on this path was getting profoundly and suicidally depressed when I was a freshman in college at Rice University in Houston. And I began to really doubt myself. I thought, wow, here I am with a bunch of really smart kids, and it's just a matter of time before the admissions committee realizes what a big mistake they made in letting me in. It was compounded by the fact that my college roommate at the time was one of the 4 people that year that scored a perfect score on his SATs, never had to study, always did great. And I began to worry that I wouldn't do well, and I really wanted to do well because I knew I wanted to be a doctor even then. And the more I worried, the harder it became to study, and the harder it became to study, the more I worried, and I got in this vicious cycle where I literally couldn't sleep for a week straight. And that kind of sleep deprivation itself is enough to make you a little psychotic. And I remember sitting in organic chemistry class thinking like, you know what? Why don't I just kill myself? I'm in so much pain. Dead people look like they're peaceful. I'm not peaceful at all. I felt like I was never going to amount to anything anyway. So, just get it over with. And I was all set to do that, and really came about as close to doing that as a person can without actually, falling through. But I came down with such a horrible case of infectious mononucleosis that I literally couldn't get out of bed. I was just so completely wiped out. And by then, my parents got word that I was kind of a mess, and they came and saw what a mess I was and took me home to Dallas to recuperate. And my crazy plan at the time was to get strong enough to kill myself, as crazy as that sounds. This was back in 1972. So meanwhile, my older sister, who was a child of the 60s, had really benefited from studying with an ecumenical spiritual teacher named Swami Satchidananda. And so when he came to Dallas, my parents decided to have a cocktail party for the Swami. As weird as, today that would be weird in Dallas, but especially back in 1972, 73. And so in walks this central casting's idea of what a Swami should look like, long white beard and saffron robes and, the whole thing. And he sat down in our living room and he began giving a satsang, a lecture. And he started off by saying, nothing can bring you lasting happiness, which I'd already figured out. That's why I was ready to do myself in. But he went on to say something that really turned my life around, which is that nothing can bring you lasting happiness. It's true, but you don't need that. We have lasting happiness already. And one of the great ironies of life is that not being mindful of that, we often run after all these things that we think are going to bring us happiness. And in the process of striving for them, we often disturb the inner peace and happiness that would already be there if we just stopped doing it. He liked to make puns. And I remember years later, people said, what are you, a Hindu? He said, no, I'm an undu, And so I decided, okay, let me move killing myself down to plan B. Let me try this weird stuff. And so I began to change my diet. And, I was growing up in Texas, I was eating mostly chilies and cheeseburgers and chalupas and, lots of really unhealthy foods. So I went on a plant-based diet. I began to meditate, even though I could barely sit still long enough to do that. Walk around, and get some exercise and try to love myself a little more. And I began to get glimpses of what it felt like to be peaceful. And what he kept saying was, what happens so much in our culture is that we think I'm not feeling very good. I'm feeling lonely. If I only had more whatever, more money, more power, more beauty, more accomplished, more sex, whatever, then I'd be happy. Then people would love me. And then I wouldn't feel so lonely and isolated. And he went on to say that once you set up that view of the world, however it turns out, you generally suffer, because until you get whatever that is, you suffer. Like, oh, wow, I hope I get it. And the stakes go up because it's not just winning or losing. It's like feeling like you're a winner or a loser. If you get it, you're a winner and people love you. And if you're a loser, you're going to be all alone. So the stresses go up along with that. We know that stress comes not just from what we do, but more importantly, how we react to what we do. And how we react is really a function of how we perceive the world. And if we perceive that we are lacking and we have to get these things that we don't have, then there's enormous stress that goes along with that. So until we get it, we feel stressed. If someone else gets it and we don't, then we feel even more stressed, and it reinforces this distorted dog-eat-dog, zero-sum game view of the world, that the more you get, the less there is for me, and you better, get it in a very hyper-competitive world. And even if we get it, it's very seductive in the moment. It's like, I got it, now I'm happy. But it doesn't last. It's soon followed by either now what? It's never enough. One of the patients in a study I did later said, I can't even enjoy the view from the mountain I've climbed. I'm already looking over at the next one. How often have you thought, gee, if I just made $10,000 a year, that'd do it. And then you did, and like, well, maybe 20,000 would be better. It never really is enough. Or if it's not now what, then it's often so what, big deal. It doesn't really provide the lasting meaning that I thought it would. Another patient years later said, the letdown that comes from accomplishing a goal is so great. I always make sure I've got a dozen projects going at the same time. And so the cycle continues. And so what the Swami taught me is that what we call stress management techniques, which are really mostly derived from things like yoga, stretching, breathing, meditation, etc., progressive relaxation techniques, they're more than yes, they are very powerful stress management techniques, but the ancient swamis, and for that matter, rabbis and priests and monks and nuns, didn't develop these techniques just to manage stress better or unclog their arteries or perform better in sports or in school or in business. It can certainly help you do all those things. But at their root, they're really powerful tools for transformation, for quieting down our mind and body, to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being, and to realize that's our natural state, is to be peaceful and healthy and happy most of the time. And then perhaps the ultimate irony, because we're not aware of that, because we think it's out there somewhere, in the process of running after all these things that we think are going to bring us peace and joy and health, we end up often disturbing what's there already if we just stop doing that. And so at the end of a meditation, for example, when you're feeling more peaceful, it's useful to remind yourself, to literally remind yourself that the meditation didn't bring you a sense of peace and well-being. It was already there. What it did was at least temporarily to stop you from disturbing what was already there. Now, that may sound like a lot of parsing words and semantics and splitting hairs, but the implications are quite powerful, because if it's out there, if you have what I need to be healthy and happy, then you've got great power over me. And I've got to figure out how to get that from you. And I'm dependent. But if it's me, not to blame myself, but to empower myself, then I can do something about. And so, okay, I thought, let me move this committing suicide down to plan B, began doing these things, began to feel better, and it really turned my life around. So I began to let go of this idea that I had to get into medical school to be happy, and realized that while I wasn't that way all the time, at least getting little glimpses of that and knowing really where it came from really transformed my life. And for me, as part of the hero's journey, it was the first experience I had of how suffering can really be a catalyst and a doorway for real transformation. It totally transformed my life. And I transferred to the University of Texas in Austin, changed my major from biochemistry to humanities, took all the courses that were really interesting to me, graduated first in my class, gave the baccalaureate. And I say that not to brag, but to say, I went from one end of the spectrum to the other, feeling like I was totally stupid and worthless, and I couldn't even read a headline in a newspaper and tell you 10 minutes later what it said. For me, what lifestyle medicine is at its best is really a spiritual path that enables us to work with people who are suffering in very intimate ways, and to show them how they can use that suffering, just as it was for me, as a doorway to transform their lives. That yes, their physical health often improves, but telling somebody who's lonely and depressed, which I think is really the epidemic in our culture these days, that they're going to live longer. We take for granted that people want to live longer, but if you're really depressed, you're just trying to get through the day. You don't necessarily want to live longer. Or telling somebody they're going to live to be 86 instead of 85 doesn't really motivate that most people, because they don't really think anything bad's ever going to happen to them. We all know that the mortality rate is still 100%. It's one per person, but we don't think about it most of the time. But I thought about it a lot because it came so close to killing myself. And so for me, that really was very liberating, because it enabled me to take risks in my professional career and in my personal life, for that matter, that I never would have done, because I thought, like, well, what's the worst that could happen? I'll learn something, right? And there's a lot of learning that comes from failing. And so I decided I was going to lead I couldn't trust anybody at that point. So I said, I need to find out for myself what's true and what's real. And so I said, I'm going to lead a kind of a messy life. I'm going to really make a lot of stupid mistakes, but I'm going to get a lot of wisdom from making those mistakes. And so if it's not going to permanently damage me or hurt somebody else, I'm going to try as many different things as I can, because there's a lot of wisdom that comes from experience. I didn't want to be one of those people at the end of my life who regretted not doing something, because I feel like if I do something, later in life as a doctor, I got a chance to work with many people who were dying on their deathbeds. And they generally don't regret what they did. They generally regret what they didn't do. Because if you do something and you fail or it's wrong, you learn from that. There's a lot of wisdom, then you know from your experience. But if you don't do it, then you just wonder and have regrets, or like what might have been. So I have led sort of a messy life in that way. I've tried a lot of things, but it's also enabled me to take risks professionally that people thought were really crazy, because like how could you do that? Because all of the things that we've done from a research standpoint, people at the time thought were impossible. And that to me is what makes them interesting. I love the moonshot speech that former President John F. Kennedy gave, which, by the way, was at Rice University, where I got suicidally depressed. He said, it wasn't while I was there, but it was years before that, but he said, we're going to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And sometimes things that are hard are really the most meaningful. The Swami would say that they build temples on hills with lots of steps because you have to work hard to get up there, so you appreciate it more. If you talk to anybody who's got kids, they'll say, that was the hardest thing I ever did, but the most meaningful as well. And so it gave me the courage to try things that were hard and to ask people to make lifestyle changes that many people thought were hard or even impossible. Because I found in my own life what a difference that made. And so it really gave me the courage and the experience to encourage other people to do the same. And so if you're in lifestyle medicine, I would encourage you to walk your talk, to make the same lifestyle changes in your own life that you're encouraging other people to make, because you'll experience the benefits. Even if you're otherwise healthy, you'll feel so much better so quickly. Then it makes you a much more effective educator. I love the story from Gandhi, where a woman brought her son to him and said, tell him to eat less salt. And he said, come back in 6 weeks. So she came back in 6 weeks, and he said, eat less salt. And she said, well, couldn't you have told him that 6 weeks ago? He said, no, I had to eat less salt, for 6 weeks before I could really tell him that. So there's a lot of empowerment that comes from being able to do that.
It's the full circle of the hero's journey that you've been through, and the power of sharing that story entails everything. Like, you can't be the father of lifestyle medicine if you haven't really lived through that journey and walking the difficult path of even facing death, suicide, the pain from illness, and a rebirth. And then the hero's journey always returns home from this unknown to the known world and bestows its learnings, its stories, its tools to their colleagues, their friends, so that they can also be helped in their journey. Lifestyle medicine, as you said, is philosophical, is even existential. And I believe that this goes beyond individual journeys, but also the collective and the planetary, and how society and the planet, animals and the air and the mountains and the water, we're all really interconnected. How does lifestyle medicine play into this interconnection of existential matter and spiritual, emotional, even philosophical concepts?
Yeah, really good question. Anything that brings us together is healing. Even the word healing comes from the root to make whole. Yoga is from the Sanskrit to yoke, to unite, union. These are really old ideas that we're rediscovering. I wrote a book back in 1998, 23 years ago, called Love and Survival, that reviewed what were then hundreds and now literally tens of thousands of studies showing that people who are lonely and depressed and isolated are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely than those who have a sense of love and connection and community. And I don't know anything in medicine that has that kind of a powerful impact. And it also impacts on our behavior, because in doing these studies later in life, I'd ask the patients in our studies, teach me something. Why do you smoke? Why do you overeat? Why do you drink so much? Why do you abuse opioids? Why do you play so many video games? These behaviors seem so maladaptive to me. And they'd say, you don't get it. These behaviors aren't maladaptive. They're very adaptive because they help us deal with our pain, our loneliness, our isolation. I've had patients hold up their pack of cigarettes and say, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes and they're always there for me and nobody else is. When I take away my 20 friends, what are you going to give me? Or they'll say food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or alcohol numbs the pain, or opioids numb the pain. We have this big opioid epidemic, or other drugs numb the pain, or video games distract me from the pain, or working all the time is a more socially acceptable way of distracting yourself from pain. But again, the pain is not the problem. The pain is the messenger. It's saying, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. And, change is hard. But if you're in enough pain, the idea of change becomes more interesting. It's like, wow, this is kind of weird stuff, meditation and yoga. Are you kidding me? But okay, it's got science to prove it. So let me give this weird stuff a try. And again, because the underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, when people make big changes in lifestyle, they feel so much better than it comes from their own experience. And it takes them past as, well, maybe it's true or maybe it's not true. And one of the reasons I've spent the last 4 decades doing the scientific research is that, properly done, good science can redefine what's possible for people and give them new hope and new choices. As I mentioned, everything that my colleagues and I have done over the last 4 decades, people thought was impossible. We were the first to prove that heart disease was reversible. That was thought impossible at the time. In a series of studies, we were able to show that. It redefined that. Now Medicare is, after many years of going back and forth, created a new benefit category to cover my program for reversing heart disease throughout the US. So now we can make it available to people who are suffering, who otherwise wouldn't be able to do it. And most of the major insurance companies are doing that as well. And so the same is true. We did the first research on the lifestyle changes could reverse a whole foods plant-based diet that's low in fat and sugar, mostly fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, soy products. Meditation and yoga-based stress management for an hour a day, walking for a half an hour a day, and some strength training, and the support groups. Eat well, move more, stress less, love more. Boom, that's it. And the more diseases we study, the more scientific evidence we have to show that. We've found that type 2 diabetes can often be stopped or reversed by making these changes. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, early stage prostate cancer. We did the first randomized trial with the chair of urology at the time at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York and at UCSF, showing that these same lifestyle changes could slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of men with early stage prostate cancer. What's true for prostate cancer will likely be true for breast cancer. We did a study with Craig Venter, who was the first to decode the human genome, showing that when you make these lifestyle changes, when you change your lifestyle, it changes your genes, turning on the genes that keep us healthy, turning off the ones that cause us to get sick. Over 500 genes in just 3 months. So often people go, oh, I just got bad genes, there's not much I can do. Even President Clinton, who I've been working with since 1993, when his bypasses clogged up 14 years ago, his cardiologist held a press conference on CNN and said, oh, it was all in his genes and his diet and lifestyle had nothing to do with it. And because I've been working with the president for so many years, I knew it had everything to do with it. So I sent him a note saying, it's not all in your genes. If it were, you'd be a victim. You're not a victim. You're one of the most powerful guys in the world. Again, not to blame you, but to empower you. And so he went on this program. He's talked about this publicly, or I wouldn't be discussing it. And he's doing, really well now, 14 years later. So knowing that we can actually change our gene and start turning on the good genes, turning off the bad genes, over 500 genes in 3 months, many people find very empowering. We did a study with Elizabeth Blackburn and got the Nobel Prize for discovering telomeres, the ends of our chromosomes that regulate cellular aging. And she'd done studies with Alyssa Epple showing that men and women who, smoked cigarettes and were sedentary and stressed out and ate unhealthy diets, their telomeres got shorter faster. And as your telomeres get shorter, your life gets shorter, and the risk of premature death from. So I had lunch with her and I said, if bad things make your telomeres shorter, maybe good things make them longer. And sure enough, we found that in just 3 months, the telomerase, the enzyme that repairs and lengthens telomeres, increased by 30%. And over a longer period of time, we found they actually grew longer by 10%. And when we published this in The Lancet, the editors sent out a press release worldwide, and they called it reversing aging at a cellular level. So, and now we're in the midst of doing the first randomized trial to see whether these same lifestyle changes may stop or reverse the progression of men and women who have early stage Alzheimer's disease. And I think we're at a place with Alzheimer's very reminiscent of where we were with heart disease 40-something years ago, that the same biological mechanisms are in play, less intensive interventions slow the rate of progressing into dementia. I thought maybe a more intensive one might stop or reverse it. Ounce of prevention, pound of cure. It's hard to reverse a chronic disease. That's why we were the first to show that in so many others, because most people didn't go far enough. And so we're in the midst of doing this study, and I'm cautiously optimistic that, first of all, whatever we show will be important, but there are no drugs that could even stop Alzheimer's from getting worse. So even if we just stop it from getting worse, that would be a major breakthrough. And if we can show that people get better, even more so. So stay tuned. I wrote a book that came out a year or so ago with my wife, Ann, who's been my collaborator as well for now over 22 years, called Undo It, harking back to the Swami's comment that I'm an undo, not a Hindu. Also, my favorite key on the keyboard and the computer has always been the undo button. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had an undo button in our lives? And now, to a much larger degree than we thought we do. It's now coming out in paperback in January, so it'll be even more accessible. And it presents this radical unifying theory that I was trained, like all doctors, to view heart disease and diabetes and prostate cancer and Alzheimer's and so on as being fundamentally different diseases, different diagnoses, and different treatments. But I've come to see that over these 4 decades, these same lifestyle changes could help stop or reverse the progression of all of these different conditions, except for Alzheimer's, we don't know yet. And I thought, well, with all this interest in personalized medicine, how is it these same lifestyle changes can affect so many different diseases? And I realized that they're really not so different, these diseases, that they have more in common than they're different. They share so many of the same underlying biological mechanisms: chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, changes in the microbiome and telomeres and gene expression, angiogenesis, et cetera. And each of those mechanisms, in turn, is directly influenced by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and how much love and support we have. And the more diseases we study, the more evidence we have to show that. So it radically simplifies both the understanding of why these lifestyle changes are so powerful and how far-reaching they can be. It also explains why you'll often find what are called comorbidities. The same person will have heart disease and type 2 diabetes and be overweight and have high cholesterol and high blood pressure and so on. And when people get put on these drugs, they're generally told, when you say, doctor, how long do I have to take these? What does the doctor usually say? Forever, right? It's like when I lecture, sometimes I show a cartoon of doctors busily mopping up the floor around a sink that's overflowing, but nobody's turning off the faucet. It's like, how long do I have to mop up the floor? Like forever. Like, well, why don't we just turn off the faucet? And the faucet, the cause is, to a much larger degree than people had once realized, are these lifestyle choices that we make. And under your doctor's supervision, if you're taking these medications, many people are able to reduce or even get off of many of these medications they were told they'd have to take the rest of their life. When I went to medical school, I learned how to do bypass surgery. I studied it with Dr. Michael DeBakey, who was one of the pioneers who really invented bypass surgery. And we cut people open, we bypass their clogged arteries, you tell them they were cured. And more often than not, they'd go home and, eat the same junk food and smoke and not manage stress, not exercise. And their new bypasses would clog up. And so we'd have to then cut them open again, sometimes multiple times. So for me, bypass surgery became a metaphor of an incomplete approach, that we were literally bypassing the problem without also treating the underlying cause. And so I wondered what would happen if we treated the cause and turned off the faucet. So part of my hero's journey is I decided to take a year off between my second and third years of medical school, much to my parents' dismay, because I thought I was never going to go back, and to do a pilot study. And so one of the nice things about going to medical school in Texas is it has much more of a pioneering ethos. Like, it's a it's not going to work, but go for it. You'll learn something, So the chief of medicine donated the tests, and the head of cardiology referred patients. And I went to every hotel in Houston, and the last one, the Plaza, donated 10 of its rooms to us for a month. One of the nice things about being a medical student is you don't really know enough to know what's not possible. So there's value in that. I wasn't fully indoctrinated yet. And so it was me and the cook. And for a month, we put these 10 men and women who had really bad heart disease, so bad they were considered inoperable, on this program. And they got better. And they not only felt better, but in 8 of the 10 patients, using a new test called thallium scans, which is now a common test in hospitals everywhere, they found the blood flow to their heart improved and their chest pain went away. Dr. DeBakey gave me a really hard time at the time. He said, what year are you, son? I said, I'm starting my 3rd year. He goes, damn, it's going to be so much harder to bust you out of here now because you've made it this far. But, he called me. He was really old school. Like, he would stick you with a needle if you didn't move your fingers fast enough out of the operating field. And he called me a few years ago at the age of 99. I hadn't talked to him in decades. He said, hi, Dean, this is Mike DeBakey. He had a very distinctive Louisiana accent, which I recognized immediately after all these decades. I said, to what do I owe this honor? He said, well, those weird lifestyle ideas that you had back when you were my student? I said, I remember I gave you such a hard time about that. I said, oh yeah, I remember really well. He goes, that's what's kept me alive all these years. I just said that I'm 99 years old. I'll be dying soon. I just wanted you to know that. My wife got interested in your work. And so that's why I made it to 99. So if the point is, it's part of the hero's journey. Even if people give you a hard time when you're going through it, decades later, they could come back and say, this was really the right thing to do after all. It's very gratifying. And so I went back to school, finished my medical degree, did it another time. This time it also was my first understanding that when you're doing something that doesn't fit within the conventional paradigm, that it's often very disruptive. It's not only disruptive on the surface, but it's disruptive to the sense of order that paradigm provides. There's a wonderful book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I had a big influence on my life, which talks about how we come up with paradigms to organize the world. And they're limited by definition because the world is infinitely complex, but we kind of mistake the paradigm for the world itself. And if something comes along that doesn't fit, the anomaly, it can be very threatening, not just to the idea itself, but to the whole sense of order. People often react in a very strong way because it feels like, we're moving to like an earthquake, like you're moving into chaos. If everything is breaking down, that's for 1,000 years, the Catholic Church provided that paradigm by saying the earth was the center of the universe and everything rotated around it. And then when Galileo came along in the 17th century and showed people how they could use a telescope to see for themselves that wasn't true. They had forced him to recant under threat of the Inquisition, but the word was out. And so then science became more the dominant paradigm. But, and science is great, but not everything that counts can be counted, as Albert Einstein once said. Not everything that's meaningful is measurable. And so the challenge in lifestyle medicine is to be able to use all of the tools that we have and not just the ones that we can measure. And ultimately, though, you mentioned, how does this help the planet? What's good for you is good for the planet. What's personally sustainable is globally sustainable. It turns out that, my younger son, my son, I should say, who's now 20, is an accomplished musician. And he loves this indie band called Wolfpack. And we went to one of their concerts last year. And the front man is a vegan. And he said, usually at the middle of my concerts, I talk about your work. But since you're here, why don't you come out and talk about your work in my concert? I said, you mean in the middle of your concert, you're going to come on stage and talk about why people should eat a healthy diet, a plant-based diet? He goes, yeah. So I did for like 15 minutes. I was cool for my son for a change, which was really interesting. 15,000 screaming millennials at the Greek Theater in Berkeley. And I didn't talk about, heart attacks and, living longer. These were people in their teens and 20s. I said, it's often hard. Like, what can I do as one person to make a difference with global warming or with feeding the hungry or animal suffering or deforestation in the Amazon? And it turns out that what you put in your mouth every day, something as primal as what you choose to eat, impacts all of those. More global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. It takes 14 times more resources to make a pound of meat-based protein than plant-based protein. There's enough food to feed the entire world. No one need go hungry if more people ate a plant-based diet. The deforestation of the Amazon is to make room for cattle grazing, and so that empowers people when they feel like if it's something that you get a sense that my actions have meaning, it makes them, if it's meaningful, then it's sustainable. And if it's pleasurable, it's sustainable. And again, there's a wonderful film called The Game Changers that James Cameron and James Wilkes and others did that talks about how elite athletes raise and so on when they change their diet. And there's a wonderful scene with these 3 guys who in their 20s who are obviously very fit. and they gave them a single meat-based meal, and they measured the frequency and hardness of erections at night when they slept. And they did the same thing a day later with a single plant-based meal. And they found that after the plant-based meal, they had 300 to 500% more frequent erections and 10 to 15% harder erections after just one meal. And it again shows how dynamic your heart also has those same changes in blood flow. So does your brain. Although this, I think, was more motivating for a lot of guys. It's like, okay, I like eating meat, but not that much. For someone who's got severe chest pain, can't walk across the street without getting pain, can't make love with their spouse, can't play with their kids, can't go back to work without severe angina. Within a few weeks, in most cases, they're able to do all those things. Then they say things like, yeah, I like, eating junk food or whatever, but not that much, because what I gain is so much more than what I give up. It's not about just living longer, it's about living better. And I'd like to show a video of one guy, it's only a minute and a half long, who is a doctor himself, who had such a massive heart attack, he was told that the only thing that could save his life was a heart transplant. And so he decided to go in my program for 9 weeks at UCLA, where we've trained them, to get in better shape for the heart transplant while they were looking for a donor. But he got so much better, his heart disease improved so much, he didn't need a heart transplant. So what's the more radical intervention? A heart, getting a new heart, or eat well, move more, stress less, love more?
Thank you. Talking about paradigm shifts and the Kuhnian definition of the structure of scientific revolutions, definitely I see lifestyle medicine as an anomaly on the system, on the current paradigm, and it's getting us into a crisis in terms of where to put our attention when we're trying to generate health and wellness. And pairing that with the hero's journey, I always wanted to ask you, when you were seeing these initial results and young Dean was really challenging what decades of the paradigm of the medical profession was telling you what's possible and what wasn't possible with heart disease and others, how did you feel at that moment when you had this information and these really scientifically backed results, but you were going out to the world to publicly say that, the disease is reversible and that we can undo all these things, even, with simple things. And, that must have felt like a really step of courage and a lot of, I guess, still is a lot of deaf ears to that information. So how do you empower yourself and others to keep pushing those boundaries and courageously talking about the power of lifestyle medicine with science evidence, but also with the courage to challenge current paradigms?
Well, again, I found it transformed my life. I feel like I've been on borrowed time since I was in college. And so that's very liberating. It's like, what's the worst that could happen? I'll learn something, right? And again, when I'm on my deathbed, hopefully, a long time from now, I want to feel like I've been spent, that I've been used up, that I don't have regrets of what might have been. And so again, I have a lot of wisdom that comes from having done a lot of stupid things in my life and learned from them. And I know from my experience, for example, people think, gosh, it's so hard to not eat certain foods. I feel deprived, or to be in a monogamous relationship. That's so boring, But what I learned is that just like I could take all the meaning out of my life when I was suicidally depressed. That's what it means to be depressed, really. The sense of helplessness and hopelessness comes from feeling like nothing matters. Who cares? So what? Big deal. Why bother, et cetera. All those kind of existential questions that you alluded to. It's like, I could take all the meaning out of everything. But later I learned that I could also put meaning in my life. I could imbue my life choices with meaning. And one way to do that is by choosing to say no to things that otherwise I could say yes to. So if I'm choosing to eat a plant-based diet and not eat a lot of meat, and having grown up in Texas eating meat all the time, do I feel deprived? Or do I say, I'm choosing not to eat certain foods because it's good for me, it's good for the planet, I'm going to feel better, live longer, be able to do things I couldn't do, watch my kids grow up, those things really matter to me. So what I gain, again, is more than what I give up. If I choose to be in a monogamous relationship, which I am, is that the ball and chain, or is it rather by choosing to be with just one person? You can only be intimate to the degree that you can open your heart and be emotionally vulnerable, and you can only do that to the degree you feel safe. So if two people are really creating this crucible of exclusivity and safety, what my wife and I have found is that we continue to open our hearts more and more and more and more. The more intimate it is, the more erotic it is, the more playful it is, the more joyful it is, the more spiritually fulfilling it is, the more meaningful it is. So what we gain, I couldn't have those, instead of having the same kind of experience with different people, I'm having these infinitely variable experiences with the same person. I know I couldn't have those if I were seeing other people. So it imbues my life with meaning to say no to things that otherwise I might say yes to. And so I think that lifestyle medicine really is an opportunity to work with people when they're the most vulnerable and they're often suffering, and to help them use that suffering as a doorway or as a catalyst for really transforming their lives. I refer to it as the conspiracy of love, if you will. That's why I'm still so passionate about doing this work. Yeah, we've shown that you can unclog your arteries and do this and do that, but ultimately, who wants to live longer if you're not enjoying life, right? That's what I learned very early in life. It was just about trying to get through the day, right? And so I think we have a spiritual opportunity, a spiritual journey, if you will, to do this sacred work, which is really fun, you know? And yes, it's hard. And yes, but look how far we've come. I mean, you've got, you know, most of the conferences on lifestyle medicine have thousands of people coming now. That was unheard of when I first started doing this work. Change often takes time, but if you can take a long view and you say, look how far we've come, yes, there's still a long way to go, but there's a convergence of forces that finally make this the right idea at the right time. The limitations of drugs and surgery are becoming more clear. The power of lifestyle medicine is becoming more well documented. People want to empower themselves to make these changes. And there's kind of a realization that we want to find an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being, which is really what lifestyle medicine at its best is about. It takes us out of the fat versus carbs arguments into something that's really ultimately much more meaningful and ultimately much more sustainable.
DrDean Ornish, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your life, and thank you for sharing, your journey, because your journey has empowered so many other journeys, including mine. Your book made a very specific mark in my life, and I would say it was an inflection point.
Oh,
And thanks to that book, we even might say that we started the Mexican Association of Lifestyle Medicine. So thank you so much. And we hope to keep co-creating the future together and change the world, change paradigms, and live our dreams.
thank you. That you made my day. I'm so happy to hear this. And to whatever degree this has been useful, I'm really grateful for the chance to be of service in such a meaningful way. So I'm sure we'll have more conversations in the future. Keep up your great work.